Hi, my name is Colin Manning. I'm a history teacher here at Bishop Kelly, and I'm working on a project on Joan of Arc. So I thought we would talk a little bit about Joan of Arc, but before we do that, we have to talk about England and France for about 400 years before we get to there. I promise I won't take forever doing that, but we have to talk a little bit about it. So first, we have to realize that the two governments of England and France were very, very different. The English government is primarily a centralized government, which means that the king had lots and lots of power, whereas the French government was not that way at all. The French king, in fact, really only controlled a little bit of area right around Paris, and his dukes, who controlled all of the areas outside of Paris, had an enormous amount of power. And that becomes important later on when we see the divide between various dukes and the then supposed king of France. So really our story starts, for Joan of Arc, really starts in 1066, about 400 years before she was even born. When a Duke of Normandy, remember I was talking about dukes and how they have a lot of power, the Duke of Normandy named William was promised, allegedly, the throne of England. And so in 1066 he invades England, southern England, and the then King of England, a guy named Harold Godwinson, races down to the English coast to battle him in a very famous battle known as the Battle of Hastings. William the Conqueror, as he becomes known, becomes the King of England after the Battle of Hastings. Harold is actually shot through the eye with an arrow. And he becomes the King of England, and actually by that point on, for the next 400 or so years, England will actually control more of France than the French king will. And this leads to a lot of conflict between England and France over the next 400, 500, what year is it now? 2016, 600 years, 700, 800, 1,000 years, where England and France will have this ongoing conflict, really dating back all the way to 1066. And in fact, much of the language you speak is due to the fact that the Norman French took over England, and that becomes, we speak a lot of essentially French words that have become anglicized. Now we've got to jump forward about 300 years or so to a guy named Edward III. Now Edward was, eventually becomes King of England in 327, and his mother was a woman named Isabella of France. Now this is important because Edward III was the grandson of Philip IV, of the House Capet, the then French king, who dies without any other heirs other than our friend now Edward III. So Edward decides to claim the French throne, and in doing so, he sets up the possibility of an English king and a French king being the same person. So one person would rule both countries. Well, the French were not particularly happy about this, and so they find this little itty-bitty part of France that used to be part of Germany, is now part of France, and it's called the Land Salic. I know it's kind of a weird term, but the Land Salic. And that little bit of France had this rule, which was that no one who got their succession through a woman could become king. And so the French nobles say, look at this, he cannot become king because of the Salic law, and therefore Edward cannot become king. Well, Edward wasn't a huge fan of this, and so in 1337 he begins what becomes known as the 100 Years' War. Now before you get all persnickety on me, I know it lasts for 116 years, but it's the beginning of the 100 Years' War. So Edward invades France at the beginning of the 100 Years' War and takes over the town of Circe and wins a very important battle at the city of Calais. Now this city has actually going to be an English protectorate for a couple hundred years and become really this very important wool center and very important city in English history. But that's for another day. Edward has a very famous son. His name is Edward the Black Prince. And if you've seen any kind of medieval movie, usually Edward the Black Prince shows up, sometimes as the good guy, sometimes as the bad guy. But he was very prominent at this time. And he wins a really important battle, the Battle of Poitiers, which basically wins that section of the war for the French. The French king, whose name was, at the time, his name was King John, he gets captured. He gets an interesting nickname, which is John the Good, because he gets captured. There's a big ransom to be paid for him. His son they try to escape, and John actually ends up going back to England to fulfill his his punishment for that, and so he becomes known as John the Good. And so he's kind of a well-liked French king, at least on the English side. And so in the end, what happens is there's the Treaty of Brittany, in which Charles V becomes King of France, and Edward gains a whole bunch of land in a certain portion of France and renounces his claim to the French throne. So everything seems to be going very well for 20 or 30 years, and then along comes a new king named Henry V, and he becomes the new English king, and he renews his claim for the French throne. Now, he goes over to France fully expecting not to win. The battle was, he was basically supposed to lose. And then he goes on and actually wins at the Battle of Harfleur, which was a little port city. And then he goes and wins a very famous battle in which he was outnumbered at least 4-1 at the Battle of Agincourt, but ends up winning, shockingly. And then signs the Treaty of Troyes, and this is how we get to Joan of Arc. Henry marries the daughter of the French king, and who was Charles VI at the time. And when Charles VI died, Henry was supposed to combine the two thrones into one. However, Henry and Charles actually die within a month of each other, and Henry's child, Henry VI, is 9 months old at the time that he dies. And France descends into chaos yet again, because there really is no real king. The French nobles don't want this baby to be king, and the English nobles and their supporters in France think that he should. So now we have two competing claimants to the throne. One is the English king, who is Henry VI, who, as I said, is 9 months old, or a person who will be known as Charles VII, who is yet to be crowned. And we have two dividing families. On one side, you have a group called the Armagnacs. They are the supporters of Charles's claim. And then you have the Burgundians, who are the supporters of Henry VI's claim. And so into this world steps a then, depending on where you name it, she's anywhere between 14 and 16-year-old girl named becomes known as Joan of Arc. She has another nickname. Her name is the Maid of Orleans. But that's who she is. Now, who is she? She's the daughter of a farmer, guy who owned about 50 acres, so not an incredibly successful farmer. At about age 13, she begins seeing visions of St. Michael, of St. Catherine, of St. Margaret. And over the course of about 3 years, they keep appearing to her and telling her that she needs to drive out the English and take Charles VII to the town of Reims to be crowned King of France. Now, Reims was the traditional area where the King of France was crowned, and so that's why she is trying to get him there. So at age 16, she starts her journey to try to get in touch with the king. She meets with a couple of nobles. They don't believe her or her visions until she tells them of this great French victory which had happened, but it was so far away there was no way she could have known about it in time to be able to tell the nobles. So they are convinced, and they decide to take her to finally meet with Charles. Now, this is part of where she gets in trouble. She is on this journey, takes her about 2 weeks or so. And for her safety and just for general welfare, she dresses in men's clothes. Now, it may not be unusual today for women to wear jeans or a t-shirt, but in those days she was considered a cross-dresser, which equals a heretic, a godless person, and she could be burned at the stake for that. Eventually she does get to meet Charles. Charles decides to test her. He dresses as just a regular courtier, not as the king. She immediately finds out who he is, recognizes him, and honors him as what she believes is the king, and he is, to some extent, convinced. So she convinces him eventually that this needs to be a religious war, a war that is fought on religious grounds, not just on political or economic grounds. And even though she technically doesn't ever fight in the war, she leads the war through her own moral example. So she, over the course of time, she encourages Charles to take the battle to the English, and that is exemplified in what is probably her most famous battle, which is the Battle of Orleans, in 1429. Orleans had been besieged since October of 1428 until she arrives in April of 1429. So we're talking about half a year, maybe a little bit more by that point. On May 4th, she encourages the French army, which had been locked inside this city, to break out of the city and to take the fight to the English. She wins a victory on May 4th. She wins another victory on May 6th. And by May 8th, the siege is broken. So within a week, she has broken a siege that has been going on for about 8 months. Once the siege is broken, she then encourages Charles VII to, as quickly as possible, head to Reims in northeastern France and be crowned. On the way, she wins another great victory on June 18th, and then Charles is eventually crowned by July 17th in Reims. Joan then works with the Burgundians to try to make peace, and it seems as if all is good and all we've got to do is push out the English and France will be whole once again, or so we thought. On May 23rd of 1430, after attempting to get Charles to Paris to invade Paris, Joan has taken off for a little while to fight a couple of extra battles, and she is knocked off her horse and captured by both English and Burgundian forces. She tries a few times to escape, including jumping out of a tower and falling unconsciously into a moat and nearly drowning. And eventually she is locked away in a tower before she is tried. Now Charles, who you would think would be there to protect her and try to get her out of this, does basically nothing to secure her release. In fact, he's trying to make peace with the Burgundians and sees her as a bargaining chip and is willing to turn her over or not protect her in order to get the Burgundians to make peace and accept him as king. Eventually, Joan is moved to a Norman city called Rouen, and if you ever get a chance, I highly recommend you go to Rouen. It's an absolutely beautiful city, and there's a church dedicated to her there. She is tried over a series of months by the University of Paris theologians, and she's tried as a heretic and a cross-dresser, that she heard the voices of demons and all kinds of things. And this takes place from February 21st really all the way through May, that she is constantly attacked and questioned. She is asked to hand over secrets of her conversations with Charles, and she refuses. And ultimately, she is handed over on May 29th to secular authorities, which means non-religious authorities. And then on May 30th of 1431, she is tied to a stake right outside where that church is today. She is tied to a stake and she is burned. They then take her body, lay it down so that way everybody can see it, and then they burn her body 2 more times. Now, this isn't the end of her story. In 1455, there was a reopening of her case. And in that reopening, she is declared a martyr. And then in 1456, there was another investigation of her case, and she is declared innocent. And then in the late 1800s, she is what's called beatified. And then by 1920, Pope Benedict XV declares her Saint Joan of Arc. And she is the patron saint of a whole bunch of things. But most importantly, she's the patron saint of France, and she's the patron saint of prisoners, and a patron saint of martyrs. She's the patron saint of the city of New Orleans and the city of Orleans. And she is pretty well beloved throughout France. In fact, if you look at old World War I and World War II posters, you will see Joan of Arc just about everywhere. And in Rouen, on her feast day, the entire city is just awash in blue and white, which are her colors. There are flags everywhere, and she is well celebrated. So that's the basic story of Joan of Arc and the history that gets us through to Joan of Arc. She was an amazing woman who did some pretty incredible things at a very young age. And hopefully you guys learned a little bit about Joan and have a happy rest of your school year.